반갑습니다. 네. 지금 약간 숨 돌리실 틈이 필요할 것 같은데 바로 그냥 그래도 시작을 하는 게 어떨까 싶은데요. 정현님 통역 가능하신가요?
네네.
네,
하이.
바로
네.
Hello, how are you?
반갑습니다. 네.
네. 지금 1시 10분인데요. 약간 시간이 조금 지체되어서 바로 그냥 시작을 하고 그리고 네, 바로 시작을 하면 어떨까 싶습니다. 오늘의 행사는 그레이엄 하먼님의 예술가 객체 한국어판 출간을 기념하는 전지구 인터넷 화상 강연입니다. 그리고 오늘의 제목은 강연문 공유가 지금 되었겠지만 예술가 객체. 책 제목하고 똑같은데 책보다 너무 이렇게 쉽고 네, 재밌게 그렇게 정리를 좀 해주신 글인 것 같습니다. 네, 안녕하세요. 저 먼저 간단하게 소개를 드리면요. 다중지성의 정원에서 공부를 좀 하고 있고 그리고 문학연구 평론 활동을 하고 있는 김미정이라고 합니다. K라고 그냥 보통은 스스로를 지칭하긴 하는데 네, 어쨌든 그러하고요. 오늘 몇 가지 공지 먼저 간단하게 드리면 아까 말씀드렸듯이 2시간이 예정되어 있긴 한데 약간 이렇게 조금씩 진행을 해야 될 것 같습니다. 그래서 50분은 강연을 듣고 그리고 10분 정도 쉬고요. 그리고 나서 질의응답 1시간 정도 예정하고 있습니다. 일부 강연은 미리 메일로 드린 강연문을 낭독을 하는데 커서 움직임대로 화면 그냥 같이 쫓아서 읽어주시면 될 것 같고요. 그리고 오늘의 강연문 번역은 이 책 번역해 주신 김효진 선생님께서 해주셨습니다. 김효진 선생님도 어딘가 접속을 하셨던 것 같은데요. 아무튼 감사드립니다. 네, 감사드리고요. 네, 그리고 네, 원활한 진행을 위해서 모든 분들의 음소거 상태를 꼭 틈틈이 확인을 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 그리고 오늘 강연자 소개는 물론 많이 여기 이제 관심 가지고 오신 분들이시기 때문에 제가 뭐 이렇게 또 설명을 할 필요가 있을까, 소개할 필요가 있을까 싶기는 하지만 그래도 그냥 간단하게 좀 말씀을 드릴게요. 미합 중국 아이오와 출신의 철학자이시고 LA 소재 남가주 건축대학교에서 교수 재직 중이십니다. 그리고 99년에 드폴 대학교에서 철학 박사학위 취득하시고 2000년부터 최근까지 카이로 소재의 아메리칸 대학교에서 철학을 가르치셨습니다. 그리고 뭐 잘 아시겠지만 최근 이 사변적 실제론 운동을 선도한 핵심 인물로 알려져 있고요. 그리고 하이데거 그리고 라투르 기반으로 해서 객체의 형이상학에 관한 연구를 발전시킨 객체지향 존재론 트리플 O라고 일컬어지는 이 객체지향 존재론 을 전개를 하고 계시고요. 그리고 뭐 아트 리뷰라고 하는 저널에 의해서 세계 예술계에서 가장 영향력 있는 인물 100인 중 한 명으로 선정이 되기도 하셨습니다. 주요 저서는 매우 많아서 일일이 소개는 어렵지만 한국에 번역된 정도만 간단히 말씀을 드리면 네트워크의 군주, 네, 갈무리에서 출간이 됐고요. 그리고 쿼드러플 오브젝트라고 하는 책이 이 현실 문화에서 아마 가장 먼저 번역이 됐었던 책이었던 것 같아요. 그리고 기이한 이 책은 번역이 안 됐고 브리노 라트르라고 하는 책이 또 번역이 되었고 비유물론도 번역이 되었고 사변적 실제론 입문이라고 하는 제목으로 아마 곧 갈무리에서 또 근간으로 나올 예정이라고 합니다. 그리고 올해 이 예술가 객체가 번역이 되었고요. 그리고 최근에 아마 객체지향 건축과 관련된 책이 또 어딘가에서 번역되지 않을까 생각하고 있습니다. 책은 여기 읽고 오신 분들도 많으신 것 같지만 그냥 아직 뭐 접하지 못하신 분들 위해서 아주 간단하게만 소개를 좀 드리면 미학을 제일철학으로 주장을 하면서 예술의 자율성 그리고 아름다움의 의미를 다시 개념화하고 그리고 재맥락화하는 책이라고 생각을 합니다. 한국에서 최근에 뭐 여기 이제 다 관심 있으시고 또 각 분야마다의 분들이 참여를 하셨겠지만 예술의 자율성이나 아름다움에 대한 논의가 이미 한국에서도 매우 역사화되어 있고 그리고 최근에는 그게 논쟁의 형태로도 이곳 저곳에서 다양하게 좀 이야기가 되어 왔던 것 같아요. 그리고 또 최근에 이제 문화예술 전 분야에서 수용자들의 가시화의 분위기 이런 것들 속에서 실제로 예술의 자율성 같은 개념들이 질문에 붙여졌다라고 여겨지는데 이 시점에서 지금 이 책이 번역되고 우리에게 뭔가를 다시 환기시킨다라는 게 굉장히 의미가 있는 것 같고 그리고 앞으로 또 이 오늘의 강연회 이후에도 얘기들이 좀 확장될 수 있으면 좋겠다라고 생각이 됩니다. 네, 그래서 오늘 강연과 질의응답에서 뭐 모두 충분히 얘기를 주고받기는 어렵겠지만 그런 이제 물꼬가 좀 터질 수 있으면 좋겠다 생각이 되고요. 그리고 네, 빠르게 그냥 진행을 해야 될 것 같아서 그냥 이쯤에서 제가 이 책 소개는 간단히 뭐 소개를 한 것도 아니지만 간단하게 그냥 말씀을 드리고 네, 오늘 200명 넘게 신청을 하셨다고 하더라고요. 그리고 사전 질문도 제가 그냥 대략 확인을 했는데 너무너무 재미있고 풍부한 이야기들이 많아서 사전 질문도 모두 이 시간에 다루고 싶다는 생각도 드는데 또 한편으로는 현장성이 또 중요해서 현장에서의 그 질문들도 좀 편하게 주고받아 주셨으면 좋겠다 생각이 듭니다. 네, 오늘 하모님이 계신 캘리포니아 롱비치에 계시다고 하는데요. 지금 현재 오후 9시라고 합니다. 네, 그래서 이 늦은 시간에 특별히 이렇게 또 한국 독자들 위해서 시간 내주신 하모님에게 감사드리고요. 지금 모셔보는 것이 어떨까 싶습니다. 네, 정현님 지금 하모님 이제 강연 들어야 될 것 같은데 네, 시작 괜찮으실지 좀 여쭤봐 주세요.
네, Professor Harman, may we begin your lecture now?
마이크가 마이크가 지금
Sorry, now I'm unmuted, right? Okay. I will try to read slowly.
Yes, let me share the screen. One moment.
네, 각자 박수로 마음의 박수로 네, 청해 듣겠습니다.
All right. Tell me when to start.
Okay.
Aesthetics as first philosophy is one of the best known phrases of O and has sometimes been controversial. Many critics imagine that O's attention to aesthetics is a way of subordinating ethical, political, or scientific concerns to superficial decorations such as lipstick and balloons. But aesthetic concerns can be found already at the heart of ancient Greek philosophy. Plato was obviously one of the greatest literary stylists in the history of philosophy, and this is not unimportant. Aristotle wrote in the Poetics that the talent for metaphor is the greatest human gift and is something that cannot be taught. But O has a special reason for placing aesthetics at the summit of philosophy. Namely, O holds that the root of philosophy is the struggle against literalism, and that the aesthetic is the enemy of the literal. The book Art and Objects was written to help explain what the struggle against literalism means. When most people think of O, they think of what it borrows from Heidegger, the notion that objects withdraw from direct access and cannot be reached by human thought, similar to Immanuel Kant's thing in itself. This difference between the concealed and the visible, which we call the real and the sensual, is certainly a large part of what O is about. But it is one of only two key distinctions in O. The other one is less widely recognized, but in some ways even more important for object-oriented thinkers. I speak of the difference between objects and qualities, which is borrowed from Heidegger's teacher Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. In the early 18th century, British empiricism popularized the idea that what people call objects are really just bundles of qualities. You may think you are experiencing an apple in your hand, but what you are really experiencing is just qualities such as red, round, hard, cold, sweet, and juicy. According to David Hume, the most influential of these British empiricists, we see these qualities together so frequently that we form the habit of thinking of them as belonging together. Therefore, we use the word apple to save mental energy as an abbreviation for the whole list of qualities. But Hume thinks there is nothing called an apple over and above all these qualities. This idea had a great influence even on philosophers who do not think of themselves as empiricists. In fact, Husserl was the first to challenge it explicitly. For phenomenology, the apple is an object over and above its qualities, which is proven by the fact that we are constantly seeing different qualities of the apple as we turn it in our hands. The object apple comes first, and its qualities are subordinated to the object. This is the respect in which Husserl and Tripolo are very much in agreement. The main difference, of course, is that Husserl thinks any idea of a thing in itself hidden from the mind is absurd. It was his famous student, Heidegger, who made room for the thing in itself with his question of the meaning of being, since being is that which always remains hidden from thought and can only be discussed indirectly, which for Heidegger usually means poetically. This is why poets such as Friedrich Hölderlin and Georg Trakl are so important for Heidegger's career. Now, let me ask briefly, in the past, I spoke a few sentences and then it was translated into Korean. We're doing it this way now, right? Where the Korean is showing on the screen and I just keep reading?
Right.
Okay, thank you. We are now able to see why Tripolo criticizes literalism. David Hume is the perfect embodiment of a literalist, which means he is someone who thinks that an object can be understood simply by making a list of all of its qualities. Even if a literalist admits that we might never get all of an object's qualities right, since some of its features might take centuries or more to uncover, the literalist at least thinks that the goal of human thought is to make an accurate list of all the qualities that every object possesses. For Tripolo, however, this is impossible and not even desirable. If an object can have different or even opposite qualities at different times, which even Aristotle said more than 2,000 years before Husserl, then this means that the connection between an object and its qualities is loose rather than tight. The central paradox here is that an object both has and does not have its qualities. This is all the more true if, as Tripolo holds, that the object can be hidden and real while its qualities are sensual, as in Heidegger's example of broken tools and artworks, or if the object is sensual and directly visible, but its qualities are hidden, as happens for Husserl's concept of theoretical awareness under a certain reading. To be an anti-literalist, and Tripolo is essentially an anti-literalist theory, is to realize that the gap between objects and their own qualities is the central topic of philosophy. In metaphor, for instance, which is one of the central topics of aesthetics, one object borrows qualities from another in a way that is difficult for the human mind to master. When the ancient Greek poet Homer says in his Odyssey that the Mediterranean is the wine-dark sea, he is not just telling us that the sea and the wine have a similar color. This is trivial and perhaps not even true. Instead, he is using their somewhat similar color as an alibi to force us to combine the two terms in our mind. Instead of thinking of the sea just as dark, we are invited to think of it as having all of the other wine qualities too: danger, oblivion, intoxication, and so forth. Also, the relation between the wine and the sea is not symmetrical or reversible in the metaphor. Literal statements are reversible. We can say either the sea is the same color as the wine or the wine is the same color as the sea, and both mean the same. But although wine-dark sea and sea-dark wine are both metaphors, they are not reversible or symmetrical, which means that they are not the same metaphor. Wine-dark sea is a sea with wine qualities, while sea-dark wine is a wine with sea qualities. In each metaphor, one of the words acts as the object, while the other plays the role of providing qualities. And there is one final point to make about metaphor, one that turns out to be very important for the book Art and Objects. For Tripolo, there is no object without qualities and no qualities without any object. Objects and qualities always come as a pair, but there is a problem here. Namely, when we say wine-dark sea, the wine qualities are here in front of our minds, since we have some idea of what wine qualities are like. But the sea that has wine qualities is mysterious to us, since we do not encounter such a thing in everyday non-metaphorical life. The sea is now what Tripolo calls a real object, meaning that this object is withdrawn, unknowable, and inaccessible, just like Kant's thing in itself or Heidegger's being. But that seems to mean that the wine qualities have no object to attach themselves to, which would violate the rule of no qualities without an object. The solution to the problem is to find a different real object to support those wine qualities. But since the sea has disappeared, we are left with only one real object that is still nearby, namely the reader of the poem. The reader of the poem is the one who must mentally perform the sea with the wine-dark qualities, just like the Russian method actors who followed Konstantin Stanislavski tried to perform a rock or a tree or a snake during their acting lessons. All art turns out to be a form of performance art. This is why I think that the first human art form was not cave paintings, but masks, even if this can never be proven because masks cannot survive for thousands of years like cave paintings do. On that note, we can shift our discussion to painting, which is the main topic of art and objects. Most aesthetic theory of the past 2 centuries can be called either Kantian or Hegelian. Kantian aesthetics treats art as something autonomous and self-contained. Hegelian aesthetics, by contrast, treats art as just another form of spirit, a cultural product that arises from the historical conditions of its time. Obviously, since O is a philosophy dedicated to exploring the structure of objects apart from their relations, Kant is a better match for object-oriented aesthetics, though we will see that this has surprising results. Kant's philosophy of art is contained in the first half of his book, Critique of Judgment. What he tells us in this book is that art can only be judged by taste, and that taste should be disinterested. Among other things, this means that we shouldn't judge an artwork to be of high quality simply because we personally like it. But it also means that we shouldn't reduce an artwork to concepts, such as a meaning, and then judge the artwork based on whether or not we like the meaning. For example, someone who is not a Christian should still be able to appreciate Christian art as long as it is of high quality. Finally, Kant does not think art can be beauty if it is pure beauty if it is useful for some external purpose. This means that he does not trust the beauty of horses because it is connected with the practical usefulness of beautiful horses looking like they can run fast. He also does not trust the beauty of human bodies, which he thinks is often contaminated with sexual lust. And most importantly, Kant does not think architecture can give us pure beauty, since architecture is always useful. Although I think Kant is wrong about this, that is the topic of a book I am publishing this summer called Architecture and Objects, so we can leave this topic for another time. In any case, Kant's aesthetic theory inspired what is often called formalist art criticism. Formalism can mean a number of different things, but at the very least, it always means that an artwork should be understood according to its internal aesthetic properties, and not according to the biography of the artists, or according to the social and political conditions under which the book was written, or the political message it might contain. Although O thinks formalism goes too far in excluding such factors, after all, some art is obviously political and must be understood that way, O does agree with formalism that an artwork has to be at least partly sealed off from the context in which it was made. Kant's theory of art is a kind of formalism, and above all, it is a formalism in which the two things that must be kept apart at all costs are A, the artwork, and B, the human who beholds the artwork. For Kant, aesthetic taste would be ruined if the beholder became emotionally involved with the artwork. These two must be strictly separated from each other. Somewhat ironically, for Kant, the important side of art is the subjective side, not the side of the artwork. After all, Kant thinks that although taste is something awakened by the objects we perceive, taste is ultimately about the fact that all humans share the same mental structure of judgment, and this is why good taste should tend to agree over time. This is reversed by the great American art critics who were associated with the rise of New York as the world art capital starting in 1948. Clement Greenberg and his younger associate, Michael Fried. Fried is still alive and a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Although Greenberg and Fried both dislike the word formalist, both of them are formalists by any reasonable definition of the term. According to Greenberg, modern painting is really about form, not content. It does not matter so much that a painting is telling a story. The important thing is that painting is done on a flat background canvas, and therefore a good painting should signal its awareness of this fact, rather than just painting a story that distracts us from its medium. Fried does a better job of analyzing the content of paintings than Greenberg does, but is a formalist in a different way that brings him close to Kant. Namely, Fried opposes what he calls theatrical art, which means art that tries too hard to provoke a reaction in the beholder. This is why Fried so strongly disliked minimalist sculpture in the 1960s. If an artist simply creates a white cube or puts a simple metal rod on the wall, Fried interprets this as a way of provoking a certain mood in the beholder, and Fried is close enough to Kant intellectually that he thinks this ruins minimalism as art. The main difference is that while Kant emphasizes the subjective side of art, Fried, like Greenberg before him, prefers to emphasize the art object itself. After criticizing the art of the 1960s for being too theatrical, Fried gave up on art criticism and decided to focus his efforts on art history instead. But even after this career change, Fried remained an opponent of theatricality. As an art historian, he quickly found a strong ally in the person of Denis Diderot, the famous French encyclopedist from before the Revolution, and also an important art critic in his time. Diderot, too, disliked the theatricality of many paintings in his time and preferred instead to focus on anti-theatrical painting. He was able to find examples in which French painters of his time deliberately built a wall between the painting and the beholder. For example, there is a well-known painting in which a desk drawer opens out toward the viewer, as if pushing them away from the painting and not allowing them in. A subtler version of this technique can be found in cases where the figures in the painting seem to be so absorbed in what they are doing that they have no energy left over to pay attention to the beholder. For instance, there is one painting in which a character is concentrating very hard on blowing a soap bubble, and another in which they are building a house of cards and focused on not having it fall down. In still other examples, the figures in the painting are absorbed in listening to someone read a story or give a lesson from the Bible. In all of these cases, it seems like there is a wide gap between the painting itself and the beholder who views it. Fried has to admit that this is a supreme fiction, since obviously paintings would not exist if there were no one to look at them. But he at least thinks that the painter should try to create anti-theatrical paintings. In his book on Diderot and the painting of his era, this is Fried's tendency, even though at the end of the book he has to admit that the greatest French painter of the era, Jacques-Louis David, is ambiguous and can often be interpreted as either theatrical or anti-theatrical, as in his masterpiece, The Oath of the Horatii. But Fried only becomes more uncertain of his theory as he writes the next two books of his trilogy on French painting. His second book is focused on Gustave Courbet, and Fried discovers that Courbet often breaks down the barrier between painting and beholder. For example, in many cases, Fried shows that Courbet puts himself into his own paintings. From various clues, we can see that certain figures in Courbet's paintings actually represent Courbet himself. In the third book of Fried's historical series, this one on Edouard Manet, often considered the first true modernist painter, the problem with anti-theatricality becomes even clearer. In many of Manet's masterpieces, a central figure in the painting is staring the beholder directly in the eyes. In at least two cases, this figure is a naked woman surrounded by other people who wear clothing, which makes the beholder even more interested. More generally, Fried argues that every inch of Manet's great paintings is flattened rather than deep, and therefore confronts the beholder directly. Fried's term for this is facingness. To summarize, Fried's first idea, which is strongly anti-theatrical, slowly collapses into its opposite, an admission of the sense in which every artwork is theatrical. And this is the surprising result of art and objects. O is usually viewed as a theory in which objects are so autonomous and non-relational that nothing can interact directly with anything else. Although this is true in one sense, it is also true that O allows for hybrid objects that are made of two other independent objects. In the case of artworks, O is actually not very interested in the artwork itself, apart from any human beholder. Unlike the French philosopher Tristan Garcia, O thinks that if all humans were killed in a nuclear war or a monster pandemic, there would be no paintings left on the earth, even if there were still many pieces of canvas with paint on the surface. A physical object is not enough to be an artwork. The beholder is also there as an ingredient, just as there can be no human society if there are not any humans. The interaction between a beholder and an artwork actually creates a new third object, just as hydrogen and oxygen can combine to form water. We can no more ask what would art without humans be like than we can ask what would water without hydrogen be like. Both questions are nonsensical. But this means that we need to challenge the basis of Kantian aesthetics. The theory in his critique of judgment is based entirely on purity, and not just any kind of purity, but a specific purity in which the artwork and the human beholder never mix. But as we have seen, and as even Michael Fried saw in spite of himself, that purity is a supreme fiction. There is no art without a mixing of the artwork and the human beholder. The grain of truth in formalism still remains, however. Even though the artwork and the beholder must always be woven together, this does not mean that the beholder can transparently understand the situation. The relation between the two must always exist in art, and yet the nature of this relation remains something in itself, something deeper than whatever the beholder thinks they understand about the artwork. In this way, art remains something deep and unparaphrasable, something that cannot be literalized. As O sees it, this is all that we need to say in order to preserve the good side of formalism. But when the artwork and the human beholder are mixed, we also see some other things that are wrong with Kantian formalism. Namely, we learn that other things can mix with the artwork as well, without ruining the autonomous self-containment of art. So what if someone thinks of fast running when they see a beautiful horse? This does not automatically ruin the horse's beauty, which means that we do not need to follow Kant's model of a cool and disinterested spectator of art. If all art is theatrical, then there is plenty of room for passionate involvement in the experience of art without necessarily destroying its autonomy. Next, so what if an artwork has a clear socio-political meaning, such as Goya's series of works on the disasters of war, following Napoleon's brutal invasion of Spain. And finally, so what if an architect makes something beautiful that also happens to be useful for social purposes? This too will not ruin the autonomy of art. In fact, since the new challenge of aesthetic theory after Kant is to allow beauty to be beauty despite its entanglement with multiple relations with other purposes and things, perhaps architecture will be our lighthouse and our guide towards a new aesthetic theory. After all, architecture has more experience than any other art with entangling aesthetics with society, politics, finance, engineering, and just about anything else.
네, 조금 늦게 시작이 되었는데도 빠르게 지금 진행을 해주셔서, 굉장히 생각보다 빠르게 지금 강연은 마무리된 것 같습니다. 강연 감사드립니다. 전체적으로 그리고 음소거를 좀 확인을 부탁을 드릴게요. 네. 아마도 이 하모님의 자율성, 형식주의 등에 대한 논의가 자율성, 형식주의 등에 대한 논의가 이분의 이제 철학 속에서의 객체 또는 연극성 아니면 리터럴리즘을 김유진 선생님이 직서주의로 번역을 해주셨는데 그런 이제 키워드가 될 만한 논의들을 통해서 자율성과 형식주의를 좀 이해해야 되겠구나 뭐 이런 생각을 좀 하게 되었고요. 네. 그리고 이런 것들이 결국은 사실 자율성 형식주의가 기존에 좀 우리에게 익숙한 방식의 논의라기보다는 그것을 재개념화하는 것들, 그리고 어쩌면 이제 목표라고 할 수 있는 것은 비근대적이고 비관계주의적인 논의의 장을 여는 그런 맥락에 좀 이 자율성과 형식주의 논의가 있지 않을까 싶습니다.